Happy Saturday, everybody. Today, I want to come to you all to talk about dysfunctional families. And before I start to talk about dysfunctional families, I wanted to kind of preface this because I am African American, I am Creole, and I have two parts of my family. So before I start to get into those issues of talking about my family, I believe that I have to give them justice. We are African American, we are Creole. One part of my family has branches in Louisiana that go all the way back to the times of the French and Spanish occupation of the territory. And another branch of my family comes out of Virginia, Old Dominion, that later moved to Texas and eventually ended up in Louisiana as well. So it's very interesting. I said all that to say this. Black people, since their time in this country, have been under siege. And before I could even talk about my family being dysfunctional, I have to give weight to the overarching white supremacist element that created some of the problems that I'll be explaining. So I think that most times when in the field of mental health and allied health, or even within the halls of academia, we're not hearing people get into the crux of those issues. Okay, there's a whole transatlantic slave trade that happened. There's a whole occupation of the French, occupation of the Spanish, of course, British America with the 13 colonies, Portuguese. That's another part of my family too. I have my great grandfather was an Afro-Portuguese man, and so that experience has to be validated as well. So I think that when you talk about intersectionality and what does that actually mean when you're talking about, the family unit, as far as African Americans are concerned, that is imperative. So, with all that being understood, I will go into some of the dysfunction in my family. I'll start with my father. My father's side of the family, from my early understandings of it, my father's side of the family got to Texas from Louisiana in the 1960s. They're originally from Alexandria. We have roots all across southern Louisiana, starting in New Orleans, heading towards Lafayette, and all those areas like that. So needless to say, like I said before, these are black people. These are different types of black people. So there's Creole, and we also had African Americans, and that's a whole different mix, especially when you get into the history of how those two groups were oppressed and how there was oppression in those same groups at the exact same time. For example, my grandmother was very much so a woman who could be passe blanche because her father could have been passe blanche. My Papa Tom was a very dark-skinned man. So we're looking at, colorism in a lot of ways, and what does that play within a black family spectrum. That's just a little bit of that dysfunction that you could look at. Now, according to my own family, we really didn't have an issue with colorism. In fact, my great grandfather that I just mentioned that was passe blanche actually, never hid the fact that he was black on purpose. He just looked like he was a man who was not black, but he used it to his advantage to help his family out. And that's very interesting because I struggle with that. I very much so struggle with that for a lot of reasons, because as a person who is visibly black and to have a relative that is not distant at all, this is my great grandfather, who actually didn't really die until like 20 years ago. So 20, almost 20, 30, 20 or yeah, it ain't too far down the road. So this man was actually black and passed as white and did his thing. But it goes in parallel contrast with my Papa Tom, who I said is a dark-skinned man, who literally had to leave Louisiana in the 1960s because he shot at some white men because they were going to kill him. He ended up leaving Louisiana with my grandmother at that time, and they moved to Houston overnight, because if he was left in Alexandria after night and they found him, they would have killed him. That's a part of the dysfunction that we have right now. One of the things that's within that is the emasculation of black men. And it's because we can't defend ourselves in a lot of cases and stay put. So that's how I understood my Papa Tom's struggle as a black man in America who had to leave. Whereas I have a great grandfather who is his father-in-law who literally could pass for a white man in the exact same town. Needless to say that, when we further dive into my family like that, that kind of dysfunction, that kind of disability of, a societal disability that kind of tears the black man down, it also tears down the black family too. So when my family got to Houston, there were a lot more issues, especially coming from rural life in Alexandria to urban life in the city of Houston. City of Houston, at that time, just like now, a place where you can come and make money, live a good life here. And there have been several waves. Like Houston is almost like a second Louisiana because it's so many of us that are here who have ancestry that's back in Louisiana. I had to deal with that as a child. I had to deal with that because of the emasculation of my grandfather and how that was something that he applied to raising his own children. He was not the man of his household. And not saying that you get into gender roles like that. I believe that in gender, there should be an equal balance between masculine and feminine energy. But within this instance, because of the racialized terror of that time, the black woman in this family, my grandmother, what we call Dia, she was able to really take over the family. And that led to a lot of dysfunctional things within that family. So I questioned myself before. It's like my father had been in and out of jail for a long time. But as I got to know my father's family a lot more, I didn't realize that a lot of them had been in and out of jail at times. And this became extremely interesting to me because I'm sitting here like, well, if you had one bad child, that's one thing. But you have 6 of them, actually 5 of them, because I have another aunt who basically stayed in Louisiana and she was good. But the ones that came to Houston kind of ended up in violence. And, they was about that life. So I really had to understand where that came from. And a lot of it is because of that destabilization of the black family, where the black father could not be the black father. My grandmother basically would bail out my father and my uncle all the time that they went to jail. I had an aunt who was deeply into drugs and witnessed horrible things here in the city of Houston, especially around the time that the crack epidemic hit, which is was government sponsored. Let's keep it real. It was a government sponsored ploy to destabilize and destroy the black community, and my family was a part of that. So I had cousins who sold drugs, and these were part of the family members who had left Louisiana and came to Houston. Needless to say, for me, I avoided that life in all costs. My maternal grandmother basically was the one who kind of kept me away from my dad's side of the family because of the violence that they were involved in. In fact, I laugh at my grandma sometimes because she used to say that, my father used to rob everybody's house on the block except hers. And my mother never told her that I was who my father was until after my mom died. And of course the records came up and it showed, this is your father. And she was like, oh my God, this is why my house didn't get broken into all these years. Because basically my father had a relationship with my mother. And I think that is imperative to understand because now we're getting into how middle-class black people who, they worked and they struggled their way up, but yet they didn't put that same thing into their children. And that's something that I explore daily because I realized that even for me, being at 34, I had to fight after 18 to do some things that weren't taught to me by the previous generation. I began to get almost a similar background to my father and my mother based on my grandparents. And that's something that I'm going to explore more. This is just a little bit about my father's side of the family. I will get into more of that down the road. The next thing that I will get into, in another clip later will be my mom's side of the family, because I think that's something very interesting to explore. But keep in mind what I said. I do not explore the dysfunctional family without understanding that as black people in this country, we had been under racialized trauma for centuries. Thank you. Goodbye.